This little how-to will show you guys how to configure a macro, ZBrush macro, to run on startup. So it will give you the ability to customize tool settings, render settings, document settings every time the ZBrush starts up. I find this useful for configuring a lot of things in the interface that have annoyed me for quite a while. If you find yourself repeatedly having to do something that's outside of the scope of what you can configure with your preferences here, then you should consider doing it in a macro because it will run on startup. I'll show you guys how to get that to work, and then it will be how you want it every time. Okay, so I'm just going to show you how to configure this. I'll go through a few of the things that I do. Some of these are specific to recording these videos, so don't feel that you have to copy this one for one, but do what you want to do for your own interface and your own setup. Okay, so first thing to get started, you need to hit New Macro under the Macro menu. So go New Macro, it will say Initialize ZBrush, and since we want to start from kind of a default setup, hit Yes, and it will go Default. And then everything from here forward is going to be recorded in the macro and played back when you want it to, either by button through the macro menu or when we configure it to load on startup. So something that you might consider, and this is something I do for these videos, is I set the rate of the background gradient to be 0 because the gradient doesn't compress very well for making videos. I changed the width of my canvas. Unfortunately, I have to go smaller than the default because I'm recording at 720p HD, which is not a lot of screen space. If you guys want to adjust your canvas size by default, you do it here and do just what I've done. Other things that you might consider doing, I set my render settings, configure those to turn on the wax preview by default. It's off by default, and then I just make my adjustments to it right here. So I know kind of roughly that 0.6 is a good preview strength, and temperature is roughly 7. And this will work in conjunction with one of my materials, which I've talked about in the material lecture, the double shade. So I actually want to make that the default shader on load up, so I'll just click that. Okay, there's double shade. And from here, if there's other things you want to configure, for example, brush settings, you can access some of those right now, but some of them, for example, turn off the spotlight projection if you want to be able to work on the canvas with spotlight active, so that will keep it from masking your tool. And the other thing is, if you want to adjust, say, for example, some of the stroke values in here, you actually need to have a 3D mesh, a Polymesh 3D active to adjust your brushes. And this is a little bit of a complication, but not much, so I'll show you guys how to proceed. So essentially, do like you're working, bring up Polymesh on screen, or any sculptable surface, hit Edit, and you can access these tools. So typically, like I've talked about in my brushes menu under clay tubes, if I want to do something custom with the alpha, like blur it a little bit extra, I can go down here and blur up the alpha to give it a little bit softer edges. And then under stroke, I can set my roll distance to be a little bit higher than 1, something like 5 or 10, and it'll give me nice soft strokes as I sculpt with clay tubes. Likewise, if you want to customize any other brush settings or stroke settings, you can do it right now. And then you just leave edit mode and you can clear the canvas. And you'll see when we play this back, it's going to actually drag the terrain 3D on the canvas, go into edit mode and do all this as you would expect when you're playing back the macro. But we're going to edit that actually out of the Z script, so it doesn't do that, but we still get the edits, or still get the modifications to the tool settings. Okay, so that's pretty much a good example of the things that are possible to do. So from here, you can go End Macro, and it will prompt you for a name and a place to store it. right? So if I go to the root of my ZBrush install, you can go to Z Startup, and then you go to Macros, and then you go to Miscellaneous. And you should call it something like, well, whatever you want, but if you call it something reasonable, like Setup Macro, or in my case, I'll call it SE Setup Macro, just so I'm clear. Just remember that name, because we're going to put this into our, in fact, I'll copy that to the clipboard and hit Save. And so that's kind of save the macro. And to be sure, you can look here under the macro menu. If it's closed, you can roll it out, and you should see a button for what you've just created. And if you hit it, it should do all the things that we've just done. And you can see that it actually drew Terrain 3D on the canvas, and we don't really like that. If I run it again, you'll see it'll do it again, and you'll start to see Terrain 3Ds accumulate over here. And we don't really want that. So what we're going to do is we're going to just edit out those lines in the macro first. So I'm going to switch to a text editor, and I'm going to do File, Open, and I'm going to open the macro that we just created, or that we just saved. So you can see, again, in Z Startup, Macros, Miscellaneous, and this will be the SE Setup Macro.txt. Open this up, and I will make the font a little bigger so everybody can read this. So you can see pretty much this is doing just what we did from the start, right? So all these buttons we pressed. When we get down here to I Press Tool, Terrain 3D, this is where we start to have our stroke. And so we can actually go in here and just delete off this whole stroke, taking care to observe where the open square bracket and closed square brackets are, because that's the start and end of the command. Okay, so I'm going to delete one by one. I'll just delete this Terrain 3D. So that deletes me selecting the Terrain 3D. This one deletes dragging it onto the canvas. I press Transform Edit. You know what that is. Press the Edit button. This is another stroke that I did. And from there, we have our brush select standard, clay tubes, adjust the modifiers, etc. So we're going to leave those, and those will still work even though we don't actually have a tool active. This is just simply a ZScript command, so it's cool. And now I'm going to delete this last stroke and our edit and clear. Okay, and we have one opening bracket here, and we're finishing with a closing bracket here. So this is everything that we need, minus what we've deleted out. So we'll just save it and close. And you'll see I'll run it again. I'll reset this, and we shouldn't see any more tools accumulate here as I go to macro, run SE Setup Macro. And we have to reload the macros, reload all macros, and then run it. So let me reset this again. And it's fine. So it's adjusted our clay tubes brush and our standard brush, and we should be okay. Okay, and now to configure the macro to run on startup, we want to go back to our text editor and open this file, right? So in your ZScripts, default ZScript.txt. What you would have by default, as you probably see it in yours, is this configuration, which is an empty startup file, which does nothing. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys this this script that I'm going to show you right now to edit for yourselves, and this will run the macro that we've just created on startup. Right. So essentially, what it says is, if this is true, if 1, press this button. Okay, and that's it. It will always run on startup. The thing that you have to make sure is that this name is the name that we've just created. right? So this is SE startup macro, and let me just confirm that that's the name that I have in my macro menu. And actually, this is SE setup macro, so we need to change this name. Okay, so SE setup macro. So that should be fine, and this should now run on startup. So we'll hit Control S to save it and close it. And now I'm going to exit ZBrush and reload it, and you guys should see that the canvas is the right size, no gradient, brush is configured correctly, and all of our render settings, preview wax should be on and correctly configured under render properties. So that's how you set up a default macro or a custom macro to load on startup and to make everything exactly the way that you want it all the time. Okay, so hope that helps and smooths out a little bit of your workflow.